Okay, and it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. Allison Titman joined the Alice Paul Institute as Executive Director in January 2021. Previously, she held the same role at the American Helicopter Museum and Education Center in Westchester, Pennsylvania. She also spent 5 years as Accreditation Program Officer at the American Alliance of Museums, where she worked with the museums all over the country to improve their operations and achieve accreditation. She has held leadership, curatorial, and exhibit management roles at several historic house museums in Washington, D.C. region, as well as the Women's Memorial at Arlington Cemetery. Allison holds an MBA and an MA in Museum Studies from George Washington University and a BA in Studies from Barnard College. She's active in the museum community in the Mid-Atlantic region, having served as board member and strategic planning committee chair for PA Museums, president and conference chair of the Small Museums Association, and the president of the Friends of the Greenbelt Museum. Allison lives in South Philadelphia with her family and 2 great cats. And if you have questions along the way for Allison, please put them in the chat and we will take those questions at the end of her talk. Allison.
Thank you so much. I just need a moment to be able to share my slides. There we go. Thank you so much for the invitation to be with you today. I'm so excited. I've been trying to find bright spots during the last year and a half, and for me, one of them is the ability to meet with people all over the country who share the same goals around gender equality and the Equal Rights Amendment. I have to admit, though, I was a little confused and even nervous when I got the invitation to speak today, because I know that those of you here for this talk have been fighting for the ERA longer than I have. I thought, what can I bring to this that this audience won't already know? But I was reassured that I can talk about 2 of my favorite topics, Alice Paul and the institution that she inspired, the Alice Paul Institute. Most people know Alice Paul, if they know her at all, for her work to embed women's suffrage in the US Constitution. Alice was born right here in Mount Laurel, New Jersey in 1885 to William and T.C. Paul, who went on to have 3 more children. Her home was a working farm of over 100 acres, but her father was actually a bank president. Both of her parents came from prominent local Quaker families. Her maternal grandfather actually founded Swarthmore College, which her mother, Tacy, attended before leaving to get married. Tacy, though, was very active in women's equality. She would take Alice to women's suffrage meetings in the local community. As a child, Alice loved to read and enjoy the activities available to her on the farm. She went to a local Quaker school and then to Swarthmore College. She majored in biology at Swarthmore, not necessarily because she was most interested in the sciences, but because she felt it was the option that she knew the least about, which I think just says a lot about her intellectual curiosity. After Swarthmore, her interests really took her in a different direction. Alice moved to New York to work in a settlement house and study social work. She spent a year there before moving to England to do the same thing. Alice appreciated the need for social work, but came to feel that it was only treating the symptoms of equality rather than the root cause. While in England, Alice was exposed to the women's suffrage movement led by the women of the Pankhurst family. She attended meetings and rallies of their organization, the Women's Social and Political Union, and quickly became enmeshed in its activities. She started to give speeches and participate in protest actions that purposely broke the law in order to draw attention to the cause. Alice was jailed 3 times in England and Scotland and went on hunger strike during all 3 confinements. The first time she was released, but the other 2 times she was force-fed. Eventually, as many early 20-somethings do, Alice ran out of money. She also needed to take a break to recover her health. So in January 1910, she sailed home. She enrolled in a doctoral program at the University of Pennsylvania and joined local suffrage efforts, bringing tactics like soapbox speeches and mass open air events that she'd learned in England to an American audience. In 1912, she proposed to the leaders of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, that she be appointed the leader of the effort to fight for a women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution. NASA's favored strategy was to persuade individual state legislatures to pass women's voting rights, but Alice was convinced that a federal effort would be more efficient and effective. NASA leaders agreed to let Alice pursue her strategy with the understanding that she would not introduce militant British methods into the American movement and that she would raise her own funds to support her work. This picture shows Alice in the center of the front row with other NASA members. Alice pulled in another American veteran of the British suffrage movement, Lucy Burns, to serve as her right-hand woman. They moved to Washington, D.C., and in less than 3 months had organized one of the largest women's suffrage activities ever seen in the U.S. On March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, they staged a parade that attracted nearly 8,000 women and their male allies for a march and a staged tableau. The march was a chaotic mess, with men violently pushing in from the sidelines to disrupt the marchers, but it made the front pages of newspapers across the country. It also disappointed Woodrow Wilson. He'd expected crowds to be waiting to greet his train, but everyone was at the march instead. After the march, momentum had really been generated for the women's suffrage movement, and Alice worked hard to capitalize on it. She fundraised, she recruited volunteers, and she worked to get legislators' attention and support for a federal amendment. Eventually, she became too much for the leaders of NASA. They had always been suspicious of her tactics and motives, and eventually decided that she could no longer operate under their organization. Undeterred, Alice and Lucy Burns formed their own organization, the National Woman's Party, and kept up their pressure on the politicians in Washington. In 1917, the NWP launched the first ever pickets in front of the White House. The women were dubbed the Silent Sentinels, standing at the front gates of the White House, holding accusatory signs while not uttering a word. Groups came from all over the country to take up sentinel duty in all weathers and conditions. President Wilson initially brushed them off, but eventually became frustrated by their actions, as did passersby. The women's signs would be ripped from their hands and they would be shoved into the street, but they were the ones who were eventually arrested for disrupting traffic. Over 100 members of the NWP went to jail, including Alice Paul. Again, she went on hunger strike and was force-fed, as were her compatriots. Finally, in January of 1918, President Wilson announced his support of women's suffrage. The House of Representatives endorsed the amendment the next month, and then, after another year of meetings, demonstrations, and lobbying by suffragists, the Senate did the same. The 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, became law on August 26, 1920. Alice had spent over 7 years at the helm of the fight for women's suffrage. What was she going to do now that it had been achieved? People were surprised to find that Alice viewed the amendment not as the end of the fight, but just the beginning. She wanted full gender equality under the law, and she reorganized the National Woman's Party to focus on it. Alice's perspective was grounded in what she had learned writing her PhD dissertation at UPenn, entitled The Legal Position of Women in Pennsylvania, which drove home to her just how disadvantaged women were by laws about topics ranging from property to divorce. It motivated her to continue her education in the law, and she obtained her 4th, 5th, and 6 degrees at Washington College, a school founded specifically for women who wish to study the law. Her thesis for her second doctoral degree was entitled "The Legal Position of Women in the United States." Even before obtaining that degree, she had become a firm believer that the way to achieve freedom from legal sex discrimination was an equal rights amendment that affirms the equal application of the Constitution to all citizens, regardless of their sex. In 1923, Alice went to Seneca Falls for the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the 1848 Women's Rights Convention. She used the occasion to debut her Equal Rights Amendment, then called the Lucretia Mott Amendment. Lucretia Mott had been a tireless abolitionist and suffragist. In addition, she was one of the organizers of the first convention in Seneca Falls, where the Declaration of Sentiments was created with its opening statement, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." The Mott Amendment read, "Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction." When Alice first introduced it, she stated, "If we keep on this way, they will be celebrating the 150th anniversary of the 1848 convention without being much further advanced in equal rights than we are. If we had not concentrated on the federal amendment, we should be working today for suffrage. We shall not be safe until the principle of equal rights is written into the framework of our government." The amendment was introduced in Congress in 1923 by longtime statesman and future Vice President, Senator Charles Curtis. In their advocacy for the ERA, the NWP used many of the tactics they'd employed during the fight for suffrage. They took copious notes on all interactions with legislators, including ones like Senator George Moses from New Hampshire, who apparently was dead against the amendment and through putting embroidery in the Constitution. By the 1940s, though, both major political parties had added the ERA to their platforms. In 1950 and 1953, it actually passed the Senate. But by then, Arizona Senator Carl Hayden had added a sentence. "The provisions of this article shall not be construed to impair any rights, benefits, or exemptions now or hereafter conferred by law upon persons of the female sex." The idea was that this would allow women to keep their existing and future special protections, rendering the amendment potentially more appealing to groups like labor law reformers who'd worked hard to pass specific protections for women workers. Alice and other supporters of the ERA believed that it negated the amendment's original purpose, so they withdrew their support and it failed to pass in the House. Alice Paul rewrote the ERA in 1943 to reflect the language used in the 15th and 19th Amendments of the Constitution, giving us the version we know and love today. The full amendment has 3 sections, with Section 1 providing for equality of rights under the law regardless of sex. Sections 2 and 3 are standard additions to amendments. Section 2 gives the power of enforcement to Congress, and Section 3 gives federal and state legislation a specific time period to make sure that they're in compliance. After 1943, Alice Paul kept advocating for the ERA, but she had also already expanded her work for equality internationally. In 1938, she had founded the World Women's Party and traveled to Switzerland to lobby the League of Nations to include an equal rights clause in its charter. As World War II approached, she provided a safe haven for several Jewish activists and intellectuals until they could secure safe passage out of Europe. Following the war, Alice was instrumental in including gender equality in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. She also campaigned to include gender equality in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In 1972, Congress passed the ERA, and Alice Paul officially retired from the National Woman's Party. She moved to Connecticut and outlived all of her family except one nephew. When her health worsened, she came to live in a Quaker nursing home just a mile from her childhood home in New Jersey. There, though in failing health, Alice received guests and tracked the progress of the ERA as it moved through ratification by the states. She made all of her guests promise to contact their legislators about the ERA. Alice Paul died on July 9, 1977, at the age of 92, without seeing her dream of the ratification of the ERA come to fruition. However, advocates for the ERA kept fighting. The time limit to ratify it passed without the necessary 38 states doing so, leaving the ERA to lay fallow from 1982 until the fight picked up again in the 1990s. Eventually, 3 more states ratified it, and now we're focused on getting the Senate to pass a bill already passed by the House that would remove the time limit for ratification and make the ERA officially the 28th Amendment. I know you have heard and are going to hear more about that effort. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about what Alice Paul's tireless work for gender equality and the ERA have inspired. In 1984, a group of members of the Now chapter near Alice Paul's birthplace decided that something should be done to commemorate the 1985 centennial of her birth. They founded the Alice Paul Centennial Foundation and quickly set about raising awareness of Paul's work and inspiring others with her story. In 1987, they purchased the only known collection of books, papers, and artifacts that had belonged to Alice. They offered items at institutions like the National Museum of American History and kept the remainder. Later in the 1980s, a really exciting opportunity arose. The owners of Alice Paul's birthplace, the Fireherms, shown here, wanted to sell the house, and they approached the Alice Paul Centennial Foundation to ask if they would be interested in purchasing it. One of the founders of APCF is pictured here, Barbara Irvine, at the press conference announcing that the foundation would in fact be making the purchase. After that press conference, Barbara and our other founders then went out and did the fundraising necessary to actually make the purchase possible. They were successful, and this is the headquarters of the Alice Paul Institute, to which our organization has evolved. The house was built in 1800 and renovated in 1880 before its 1883 purchase by Alice Paul's parents. It remained in the Paul family until 1958. The Alice Paul Centennial Foundation purchased the building and 6.5 acres. They quickly worked to have it designated a National Historic Landmark. Sidebar, their first application was denied. They were told that the fact that the Sewell Belmont House was already a landmark was enough recognition of Alice Paul. Fortunately, they reapplied and the organization rethought its decision. The house was restored in 2001 to the way it appeared when Alice Paul lived here. Today, the mission of our organization is to honor the legacy of Alice Paul's work for gender equality through education and leadership development. And our vision is gender equality for all. The house has never been a traditional historic house museum. There is very little furniture because what's important for us is that it's a flexible space. We can give people tours that focus on the women's suffrage movement and Alice Paul's contribution to the movement for gender equality. But we can also welcome a class of second graders to make their own women's suffrage signs and march around the house in a faux protest. Our leadership very early on decided that the best way to honor Alice Paul was to create the next generations of female leaders who would take on her work for gender equality. We have a slate of leadership development programs, of which I'll talk more in a moment, as well as an archive and library, and an exhibit that talks about Alice Paul's work. These are the members of our Girls Leadership Council on a visit to Washington, D.C. to learn about and participate in advocacy work. GLC meets once a month during the school year to discuss issues affecting women and girls in the U.S. and around the world. They practice their leadership skills through participation in an executive board and committees. They design projects to benefit other girls and women. They network with professional women, finding role models and mentors to help lead them forward. And they learn to use their voices to advocate for gender equality and other causes that matter to them. Other programs for girls that focus on leadership include our Alice Paul Professional Leadership Institute, which involves high school girls in thinking and planning for college and career opportunities, similarly providing them with women role models and having them think about what their rich future will look like. We also do a program for middle schoolers called Lead Away that empowers them by teaching them to utilize and better understand their own leadership skills and to use those unique leadership traits to affect positive change in their communities. Beyond our slate of programs for girls, we are also active in our community and with other efforts that educate youth. We give tours of Fallsdale. Previously, those were all in person. Now they're in person as well as virtual. We present 1 to 2 community programs a month on topics related to suffrage, civic engagement, gender equality, and the ERA, and also do programming on demand for local community groups. For youth, we have field trip programs and in-school programs that serve all grades on Alice Paul, the suffrage movement, and leadership. Our community programs are listed on our website and are all currently on Zoom, so I hope you'll think about joining us. You can learn more about the Institute's work at alicepaul.org, and I know several of you are already familiar with our other website, equalrightsamendment.org, but if you have not visited, I encourage you to do so, if only for the fun downloads that you can use as new Zoom backgrounds. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Allison. And now we will go forward with questions. I will say that a pretty large group of us were planning to come visit you and go on to Seneca Falls in March of 2020. And very disappointingly, we had to cancel that, but thank you. And we have some questions in the chat that you can offer us.
We do, Jimmy. We have several. The first question is, do we know what made President Wilson change his mind in supporting the movement?
So there are some great books out there about Alice Paul and Woodrow Wilson. They're listed on our website. I encourage you to do a little reading. I think working in this position at API has turned Woodrow Wilson into my least favorite president. I already knew that he was thought to be racist and narrow-minded. He also really applied that narrow-mindedness to women's suffrage. He was not personally in favor. He didn't see the point. I think what changed his mind was, as I noted, annoyance at the suffragists, as well as what had happened during World War I. It was really too much for me to go into, but the participation of women in the war effort combined with the suffrage movement really made it impossible for Wilson and our other legislators to ignore women's contributions to our society. Those two things just really brought women out into the public sphere, especially sort of mainstream middle-class women were the ones who had the power to advocate for the right to vote. And the war also made it palatable for Wilson to come out in public and support suffrage in a way he hadn't done before.
Great, thank you. Are there plans for an Alice Paul statue in New Jersey? There are so few statues of women sheroes in the US.
We don't specifically have plans for an Alice Paul statue in New Jersey, but there are statues of Alice either existing or planned. There's a relatively new women's suffrage monument in Virginia near the Occoquan workhouse where Alice Paul and the other NWP members were imprisoned. And Alice is heavily featured there. There's also an effort to replace one of the statues that New Jersey has in the US Capitol with a statue of Alice Paul. As much as we'd like to have her even more acknowledged in New Jersey. She's actually pretty well known around here. So I love the idea of her getting more attention in DC.
Great. Is Alice Paul's dissertation on the legal position of women in the U.S. available to read online anywhere?
Oh, this is a great question, and one I'm always excited to answer. Alice Paul's dissertation is available to read online. The University of Pennsylvania has one copy that is digitized. There's an effort underway, spearheaded by a professor at UPenn and her students, to fully transcribe it to make it more readable. She has actually gotten some attention for that project, including an appearance on NPR and a program that she did with us, because UPenn should have 2 final bound copies of Alice Paul's dissertation, and they don't. That was the requirement for everyone's dissertation, and Alice Paul's copies either don't exist or are missing. The one copy they have seems to be a draft, because it's a mix of a couple different handwritings as well as some typed portions, and no one knows if a final copy exists, and if it does, where it is. So as you're going around to used bookstores, if you know any rare booksellers, please keep an eye out for Alice Paul's dissertation. We would all love a final copy.
Great, thank you. Are the leadership programs for girls available to young women outside of New Jersey?
They are now. With the pandemic, we pivoted all of our programming to virtual and are now working to make everything available in both virtual and in-person options. Our Girls Leadership Council is actually offered in a hybrid fashion, where there are girls here at the Alice Paul Institute at the same time as there are girls in DC, California, and other locations attending via Zoom. And the 2 groups are allowed to, or permitted, able to talk to each other, thanks to some really great technology we were able to get because of a grant that saw the importance of bringing girls together to take part in these leadership development opportunities.
Great. Do we have a strong advocate for the ERA in the Senate that can influence the course of the amendment? Have you reached out to Kamala Harris or Jill Biden to help?
So the Alice Paul Institute participates in the work of the ERA Coalition, and I know you're going to hear more about the coalition's work later in the program. So I'm actually going to let them handle this question, because I know that they are hard at work finding advocates in the Senate for the effort.
Great. So this last one is a comment. The Alice Paul Institute was kind enough to grant me, this is from Audrey Muck, permission to use several photos from the archives for her documentary series, Brazen Bells. And she expresses her thanks to the Institute for sharing those photos. So I think that's all we've got.
You're very welcome, Audrey. Thank you.
And I have one more question, Allison. Could we actually credit Alice Paul with some of the modern demonstration techniques that we now use in the United States?
Totally. And I don't think she gets enough credit for her innovations in protest and advocacy work. I tried to highlight a few of her efforts, the way she got inspired by the British suffrage movement, brought some of their tactics, but also used her own. Like I said, the NWP was the first group to protest outside the White House. I grew up outside of DC. I was very used to every time I went by to seeing multiple groups protesting. So it's mind-boggling to me that no one had really thought to do that before. But I think that Alice Paul's work, the work of the NWP, really changed the way people thought about the president and their legislators, so that they weren't these figures that should be shut away behind gates and not listening to their constituents. And that if they weren't listening, you had to use tactics that would get in their face, that would make them listen.
I think we have one more question in the chat, Anne.
Sorry about that. That one just popped up. Actually, there's 2 more. Does the NWP still exist?
Great and very timely question. Last year, the NWP dissolved as a separate organization. So they deeded their former headquarters, the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, to the National Park Service so that it could continue to be preserved and interpreted for the public. And they gave the NWP archives to the Library of Congress, which actually already held some collections related to NWP history. LOC is currently heavily involved in cataloging and digitizing those collections. We at the Alice Paul Institute took the trademark and some responsibility for the legacy of the NWP. We committed to using that legacy as a reminder of the importance of talking about the women's suffrage movement and the NWP's work for gender equality. So we try to do programming related to that advocate and activist legacy.
Thank you. We only have time for one more question. We've got two up here, but I'll go with the next one that came in. And are you associated with the Women's History Project?
We are associated with a lot of different organizations and efforts. I'm not sure about the Women's History Project specifically, but if someone wants to reach out and send me more information, please do. I do want to note the last question is about Polly Murray. Our community, one of our community programs in November is actually about Polly Murray and will be presented by Rosalind Rosenberg, who wrote a biography of Polly. So I really encourage you to attend that virtual program if that's one of your interests.
Great, thank you. Jimmy?
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Allison. That was an incredible overview of Alice Paul and the Institute. I have family in New Jersey, and that is one of my goals, is to get up there and go and visit the Alice Paul Institute.